There's so many demands on money. We need money for poverty alleviation, building infrastructure, repairing the Ukraine, spending money for climate change. No longer do we have a mentality like an individual might have. They might say, how much money do we have? What should we spend it on? The big difference between individuals and governments is the governments don't have that constraint because they can print money. So I think we have this trade-off. Whenever in history you have a lot of debt and a lot of financial assets, it becomes very, very difficult for those to be balanced. And we're now in a shift. Prior decade, we had falling interest rates, which were goods for holders of bonds. Cash was very cheap. And so the whole investment landscape was very much built around that. Now we're having this adjustment away from that. So central banks try to balance growth and inflation. And so it will be a difficult balance, which creates an environment of stagflation, I'm afraid.
We are in decline. We're declining on a relative basis, but even also some measures in an absolute basis. So that's what the arc is. And then China has been the leading competitor. I've been having, not since 1984, I've been going to China. I watch it since I started going there. Per capita income has increased by 26 times. And so if you use measures of comparability in military, technology, share of world GDP, you see that. That is the only real power. There are military powers, but history has shown if you're a military power and you're not an economic power, while you may be a threat, you're not going to win the war. So that's what the picture looks like.
So if you go back,
and we could see it, right? We can see it in our various ways. Do you earn more than you spend? Okay, do you have a good income statement? And do you have a good balance sheet? Do you have one or two parents who care for you and give you the guidance and the values? Can I go to a good public school and have food and health care and come out with an environment of equal opportunity? Because if you do those things, you will have a civil population that will be productive and that you will be financially capable, strong. So you're going to do things better and better and you'll be strong. So it comes down to those fundamentals. When I look at one country or another and I'm thinking, where do I want to invest? It's like I'm looking at those things. Do they have a problem with internal conflict or is it orderly? Just those basics. Now, the question is, can we do those basics? How are we doing on those basics? You have measures to judge that. Yes, we can do it. And I think the most important thing is how we are with each other. Do we have a democracy in which we can come together and have a very strong bipartisan middle and then work on dealing with those things? Governor Lamont touched on some of those basics. So that becomes the big question, I think. If you give a lot of money and credit and you make it cheap enough, they will spend it. Okay, but when you create debt, it's stimulative over the short run and depressing over the long run. Because when you have to pay it back, then you have to earn more than you spend to pay it back. So what do you do with that debt? If you make it tough to pay it back, then what happens is you have an economic downturn. If you make it easy, you print the money. And that's the cycle. So when we look at what the Fed has done, the Fed and the government together gave an enormous amount of debt and credit and created a lurch forward, a giant lurch forward, and created a bubble. And now they're putting on the brakes. Okay, so now we're going to create a giant lurch backward, I think, because it's simple. The amount we talk about inflation. Inflation is a very simple thing. It's the amount of money that's spent, money and credit spent, divided by the quantity sold is the price. And so if you take that money away, you can't get rid of inflation. The way you get rid of inflation is to get people to spend less. And that is what an economic downturn. So the cycle goes like that. And then when you get to the point where let's say the economic pain is greater than the inflation pain, then you see them do the opposite. So we're going through that particular cycle. So it's, I think, a delusion to believe that, okay, what they're going to do is deal with inflation and it'll all go away because they'll deal with inflation by doing that without realizing what that means in terms of that, what that means of buying power. Think about the supply-demand of bonds. Just to give you, we have to sell debt. The government is going to borrow, central government's going to borrow about 5% of GDP. So they have to sell bonds in that amount. The Federal Reserve is going to sell, or have run off the balance sheet, about 5% of GDP. That's 10% of GDP. Who's going to buy the bonds? Who's going to buy that? Now they don't want to buy the bonds. We've had, pension funds, others, they don't want to buy that bonds. Foreigners don't want to buy the bonds. So then the way that works is interest rates have got to go up to a level that constricts private credit demand. And when that happens, then there's less spending. That's the mechanics. So there's that trade-off. And I think we're going to be in an environment in which they're trying to navigate these two difficult. You don't want too much inflation and you don't want too weak an economy. And so they're trying to navigate that, which will be probably something like the 70s. And that's all happening in the context of the political conflict, which is very important, and the international conflict, because the international conflict has bearing on things like inflation, supply lines, and all of that. Governments are like people, meaning when you spend, you think the basic economics works the same. The only difference is they get to print money. So when you spend, you think, how much money do I have to spend? And then, wherefore, what do I prioritize it on? Governor Lamont has that challenge. We all have that challenge, not the federal government. So what happens is the government says, what do we need to spend money on? And they then go spend the money, and we don't have that balance. So that issue is a big fundamental issue, particularly when we have populism of both sides. You shouldn't look at the value of the dollar in relationship to other currencies as much. I mean, they're all bad currencies. So we can get into why Europe is a bad currency and why the yen is a bad currency. They're all bad currencies. And they are all depreciating in buying power, just like the 30s, just like the 70s. They all depreciate in relationship to what they can buy. Currency is money. But when we look at them, one in relationship to another, we may not pay attention to that. So that's our existing set of circumstances. Okay, the answer is the euro? Are you kidding me? We can go on about Europe's situation. Wow, oh my God. And then, okay, what are they doing in the end? They're just printing the money, whatever it is. And so the question is, what is a storehold of wealth? Money is a medium of exchange or a storehold of wealth. And it's not a good storehold of wealth when the interest rate you're receiving is much less than the inflation rate. So that's what you're seeing happen.